What's up guys, how's it going? Welcome to another video here in the channel. Today, I'm going to talk about the Diane Dahn case. If you are not subscribed yet, please subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications. Now, without further ado, let's go to the video. On May 1st, 1988, Diane Dahn should have stopped by the house of the couple of friends to go together to work at the San Diego Transit Corp., a company located in the city of San Diego, California. Diane used to give a ride to this couple of friends every day. However, that day, she didn't stop by their house and also didn't contact them to let them know. Obviously, this couple of friends found Diane's attitude strange. They were worried and started to think that maybe something had happened to her or to her son, who was only 2 years old at the time and that she was raising alone. The two tried calling her several times, but Diane didn't answer any of the calls. With that, they decided to go to work believing that a woman would show up later at the scene. However, the hours went by and Diane didn't show up for work, something that made everyone very worried since she had never done that before. The couple decided that after the end of the day, they would go to Diane's apartment to check that everything was okay. In the late afternoon, the end of working hours, as they had decided, the couple went to the apartment complex where Diane lived, which was in Santee, California. As soon as they arrived at the apartment complex where Diane lived, they went up to her apartment, and from afar, they could see that the door of the property was ajar. They carefully pushed open the door and saw Diane's 2-year-old son standing there alone in the living room. The boy went to meet the couple, so they asked him for his mother, and the boy, in his innocence, said that his mother was sleeping, with red paint all over her body. Already expecting the worst, the couple decided to go to Diane's room, and there they found her lying on the floor. Diane was without her clothes. There was a lot of blood in the place, and her body showed marks of violence and several perforations. The couple was horrified by the scene and immediately called the police. As soon as the police arrived at the crime scene, they realized that this case would be delicate. In a preliminary analysis of Diane's body, it was noted that most of the punctures were in the face, chest, and back, and the murder weapon was probably a knife. There were blood splatters everywhere, especially on a nearby closet where her body was lying. The team also noticed that nothing in the apartment had been stolen. They even found the victim's purse containing money lying next to her. From this, they deduced that the criminal's only objective was to force relations with Diane. At the time the crime took place, it was very common to solve this type of case through fingerprints. DNA analysis technology was not yet advanced as it is today, and had imperfections. In this way, the police collected as much evidence as possible at the crime scene to see if they could find any fingerprints of the criminal. They took several objects, such as a knife shat that was on the floor, bed linen, and also a lamp that they believed the criminal could have touched. In addition, samples were also taken for under Diane's fingernails and a few strands of hair that were on her palms. Subsequently, detectives went after possible witnesses. They spoke with neighbors, friends, and relatives of the victim. As the days went by, everyone close to or in contact with Diane was called in to give a statement, in a long and very thorough investigation process. Practically all of them were on the police's radar, until the innocence of each one was proven and the list of suspects could be reduced. And it was during these testimonies that people close to Diane began to report a certain distrust on her ex-husband, a man named David Bayer. Diane and David began a relationship around the same time that she had moved to San Diego, California, to be closer to her parents. Sometime later, the two decided to get married. They had a son named Mark Bayer, and their marriage lasted almost 10 years. According to family members, the constant fights and discussions made Diane and David's marriage no longer sustainable. Still, according to family members, these misunderstandings between the couple were so ugly that there was even a physical aggression on the part of both, and that was one of the reasons they suspected that David could be the author of the crime. Victoria Dahn Minter, the victim's sister, said in later statement that her sister's ex-husband was the first person who came to her mind as soon as she learned that Diane had been the victim of a crime. When detectives went to David's house to talk to him, David said he had no idea something this bad had happened to Diane. In front of the detectives, he was very shocked and devastated by the news, and was surprised when he was informed that he was considered the main suspect in the crime. Upon seeing the state in which David was when he received the news about his ex-wife, the detectives began to wonder if he really had nothing to do with the crime, or if he was an excellent actor. This doubt was later resolved, as David had an excellent alibi that proved that he was away from the scene of the crime at the time it occurred, and thus he was ruled out as a suspect. But although David was no longer considered a suspect, friends and family of the man have reported that after what happened to Diane, he was never the same. Some say that despite the troubled relationship he had with Diane, he still cared for her, and her passing took a toll on him psychologically. Deep down, perhaps David considered the possibility of resuming their marriage so that he, Diane, and their son Mark could be a family again. But now, he knew that it would no longer be possible. Even after a long investigation and all the efforts of the police, in later years the crime remained unsolved. There were no witnesses and no fingerprints either. Somehow, the criminal managed to break down the door that gave access to the victim's property without anyone seeing or hearing anything, even with all those apartments around. The idea that someone had committed such a brutal crime and still gotten away with it troubled the entire police department working on the case. But since there was no evidence that could help them get to the criminal, there wasn't much they could do, and so the case was dropped. In the early 2000s, DNA technology was already evolving and was helping authorities solve cases that were previously considered hopeless. A police department team that was responsible for investigating Diane's case years before decided to run tests on the material found under her fingernails to see if they could find any correspondence, but unfortunately nothing was found. A decade later, in 2010, another team from the same department had the strands of hair found in Diane's hand analyzed. Their goal was to see if these hairs matched the genetic material found under Diane's fingernails, as if didn't, it meant the crime could have been committed by more than one person, which would further complicate the investigations. A few days later, the analyses were ready, and the result was positive. Both the genetic material found under Diane's fingernails and the strands of hair in her hands belonged to the same person. Around the same time, the authorities decided once again to take the results of the analysis and throw them into the police database to see if they could find any matches. But unfortunately, just like 10 years before, no matches were found and the case remained unsolved. In the year 2020, more than 30 years after the crime, the authorities partnered with a laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy, and this time, a new examination with the analysis was carried out. In this new exam, the laboratory would analyze the human genome to try to know a little more about the individual's ancestry, and thus gather his relatives. It may seem strange that the authorities would want to reach the criminal's relatives, but this was necessary because, as there was no record of him in the police database, it meant that he was never arrested, and finding a relative of his would be the easiest way to reach him. And it was from that the investigation had a great advance, since it was possible to find countless relatives of the criminal. This was only possible because these relatives of his already had their DNA in records that were public, either by genealogy companies or by some public sector. In total, the authorities were able to trace more than 1,300 relatives of the criminal, and through them, they began to assemble several family trees to know which branch the man they were looking for belonged to. One of the people who worked on this new investigation later said that it was an extremely laborious process, but all this effort on the part of the authorities would be rewarded, and soon they realized that it was all worth it. A few months later, the authorities managed to get the possible children of the criminal, and now, after years of fighting to solve the case, they finally had a name: Warren Robertson. Warren had no history of violent crime, only minor offenses such as shoplifting and bar fights. He was even registered with the police, but as his crimes were not of a violent nature, he did not have his DNA collected. The police then decided to gather more information about Warren, to find out more about him, and that if he was indeed responsible for the crime. They tried to find out why he chose Diane as his victim. It was discovered that Warren Robertson was born in the state of Arkansas, but later moved with his family to California, where he lived a good part of his life. He lived in the same apartment complex that Diane lived in, more specifically in a building next door to hers at the time of the crime. It was also discovered that he, like Diane, was a fan of stock car racing, and that the two even attended the same event that took place at the time. With that, the police began to theorize that perhaps the two had met at one of these events, and Warren had become obsessed with Diane, and after discovering that she was practically his neighbor, he began to pursue her. At the time the crime occurred, Warren was 27 years old and working as a tow truck driver. He was never questioned, much less investigated by the police. He was completely off the radar of the authorities. A few months after committing the crime, Warren abandoned his family and moved to the city of Lakeside, and later, he went to live in the state of Indiana. With all this information in hand, authorities were almost certain that Warren Robertson was responsible for the crime against Diane Lynn Dahn. He lived in the same apartment complex as her at the time of the crime, and also attended the same stock car event she went to. This couldn't be just a coincidence. But to be sure, the police would need to perform a DNA test on one of Warren's children. They then contacted one of his sons and asked permission to collect his genetic material, and that son agreed. With the genetic material in hand, the authorities had it analyzed to see if it was compatible with the genetic material found at the crime scene. Expectations were high. More than 30 years had passed since the crime occurred, and if the result was positive, it would be the beginning of the end of decades of anguish for Diane's family. The analysis took a few days, and the result was positive. Warren Robertson was responsible for the crime against Diane Lynn Dahn. Warren Robertson was the man authorities had been after for over 30 years. Well, now it was just a matter of locating him and taking him to court so that he would pay for what he had done. But that would no longer be possible, since when the police went after him, they discovered that he had died in a fire that occurred in 1999 when he was 39 years old. Despite not being able to arrest Warren and bringing him to trial, at least a conventional one, the team responsible for solving the case celebrated. According to them, they have always been very committed to bringing answers to the family, no matter how much time had passed, and with the news that the case has been solved, they hope to bring a sense of peace to Diane's family. After Diane's family was informed that her case was finally solved, Mark Meyer, her son, who was only 2 years old at the time, commented that he was very happy that the case was solved and that it would bring some peace to his family. He also said that despite being in the apartment when the crime occurred, he doesn't remember anything, and unfortunately, he barely remembers his mother, and that everything he knows about her was passed on to him by her friends and family. After the crime against his mother, instead of Mark being taken care of by his father, he was adopted by a couple of friends of his family, since according to some sources, his father was not in a psychological condition to stay with him. About this, Mark said that he was raised with a lot of love and that he even gained 2 older brothers. He saw his grandparents and other family members regularly, but he confessed that sometimes he would start crying out of nowhere, as he felt very lonely and missed his mother, even though he didn't remember her much. Mark also took the opportunity to thank the police team that managed to solve his mother's case, and said he was very impressed with the investigative work they did. Victoria Dahn Minter, Diane's sister, also commented on the resolution of the case. She said that she and her sister had always wanted to raise their children together, and that when she heard about the crime, she was heartbroken. It was as if she had lost a part of her that day. She also said that when she received the news that her sister's case had been solved, she was very happy, and that joy was only compared to the birth of her children. As for Warren Robertson's family, I didn't find out if they manifested themselves or not. This was the 5th case the team was solved using genetic genealogy, and they say they hope to solve countless more that remain unsolved. Alright folks, so that's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end, best wishes, and I see you next time.